So we'll go ahead and get into the presentation. So what we're going to go over today is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard over the last several years, is the gas mega rule, and really the kind of the three main parts. So we'll kind of highlight from the beginning and then go through some of the details within the rule. We'll go over the gas gathering rule, and it's kind of the part two of the mega rule. The valve installation and minimum rupture detection standards rule, that was part of this, and then some recent enforcement discretions that were recently just published, as far as PHMSA's stance on some leeway with some of the final rules. And then at the end, kind of want to circle back up on some of the section 113 and 114 of the Pipes Act of 2020, just to highlight if some folks were on the presentation before, I talked quite a bit about this, and I kind of want to bring that back up because it is an important topic that PHMSA has brought into the pipeline safety rules, and around the greenhouse gases and the emissions part of the bringing kind of what you would typically see from the EPA side of things. So getting into the gas mega rule itself, so this was a rule that stemmed from, like I said, from 2010 San Bruno incident, and the Pipeline Safety Act of 2011 had some of the advanced notice of proposed rulemakings along with that rule. And a lot of the 2011 Pipeline Safety Act was stemmed around materials verifications. So actually knowing as an operator what you have in the ground from your pipe, so your OD, your wall thickness, your grade, and being able to confirm your allowable operating pressures and versus your design of your pipe within the class 3, class 4, and HCAs, and for obviously those higher consequence areas. And that's really, and then based from there, 2016 the Safety Act had some of these notice of proposed rules. And then really in 2019 is whenever these, what folks have deemed the mega rule, really started rolling out over the last several years. So you really had three parts. Part one was transmission specific with the gas, and there are some liquid parts that were in there that we'll discuss around some leak detection. And that was rolled out back in October of 2019. And then in 2021, you had the gas gathering that a lot of operators on the upstream side and even the midstream that have gathering that are not typical transmission lines that have a lot of implications that is in effect now. And then recently, as end of last year, kind of that final part 3 of the transmission specific rules were implemented. So kind of recap on the part 1 rule, excuse me, was that as I stated, the rule was published October 1st of 2019. And one of the major items for the first part of the rule was the MAOP revalidations. So as I talked about, the from 2011 Safety Act was around the MAOP verifications and what we call, and people may have heard of TVC, so traceable, verifiable, and complete record set of your pipeline records. And so one of the key items within the first part of the final rule was the MAOP revalidations. And so what that entails is going through the MAOP confirmations, confirming MAOPs that were not confirmed or outside of the original scope of the 2011 Safety Act, to come up and verify the materials. And operators, kind of one of the key things was operators have by 2028 have to have 50% of their mileage completed with that. And I'll go and kind of go into, I think the next slide here, I'll kind of give a high level overview of what that entails. And that's one of the big ones that we'll dive into. And then another key item was integrity inspections outside of HCAs. So historically, if on a gas transmission pipeline, if your segment did not contain an HCA, then you weren't required to have any special integrity inspections. If you have an HCA, then you fall under subpart O of the INP rule, and you would have your full integrity management plan that you would set your inspection intervals, and you would come up with your baseline inspections and determine your methodology of assessments, whether you're going to do allies or ECDAs, hydro test. And so what this first part of the rule did was expanded rules outside of HCAs and MCAs now that operators have to go and do inspections on that you normally would have not had to have that requirement. Another key item was, and obviously the inspection criteria has expanded. And so with that, they also included the ILI inline inspection tool launcher and receiver safety. And this basically stemmed off of several incidents that have happened with loading and receiving tools. And so now there's a standard with you have to have your safety devices and be able to determine your pressure within the trap itself and depressurize and have the procedures in place within your O&Ms for those devices. The rule also expanded some assessment methods with that as part of their integrity rule. And then kind of, as I mentioned, the leak detection for hazardous liquid lines. And so now all of your liquid lines have to have a leak detection system. And the rule still gives you options for that. And it's really operators, up to the operator on how they want to implement. You can still, mass balance and look at your response times and integrate your emergency procedures. Obviously, looking at what's the affected public, the environment, and how your system is going to cause, the minimum damage if you were to have an incident or a leak. And then the other option too is to have a actual CPM system that monitors as far as leak detection. And then if you do have that full CPM system, then there's you have to follow the recommended practice for implementing that. So those are the kind of the key items for what was the first rule that went into effect in 2019. And also too, these rules, which I'll talk about a little bit later, Obviously with the operations and maintenance, your O&M plans and your IMP plans and your procedures and your standard operating procedures require updates to the actual programs themselves. So I want to touch base kind of quickly on the actual MAOP process. This is really just an overview of that process, and it's a key item. Obviously, this has been since 2011, as I mentioned, the first Safety Act that really brought in the TVC to verify your materials. And obviously, it was brought up again based on the part one of the mega rule as far as your reconfirmations. And so, you know, you go through and you say, okay, well, I have all these pipelines and maybe they're older lines and what we can do. And really and you should have a procedure that goes through, but this is a high level process of going through records collections, through alignment sheets and completion reports and POs and your project books of actually going in and finding the MTRs and the hydro test and that information, and then assimilating it through a data capture template is essentially, if you can kind of think of rebuilding your pipeline virtually. It's kind of the analogy I like to give. And some people, if you're familiar with GIS systems, you know, a lot of people will use data capture templates to then feed into their GIS systems to be able to extrapolate the data and be able to view and determine the gaps. But essentially, you're basically rebuilding your pipeline from start to end with your records, and going through and filling in your important features, your OD, your wall thickness, your grade, and then obviously those are the certain elements that you have to actually calculate your design and calculate your MAOP. And then typically you would capture, other important items on as far as fittings and your coating and some of those other things that since you're going through the records, you should capture just from an operations standpoint. And then basically once you capture that data and then you go into your engineering assessment, and this is where you determine where you have sections or populations along your pipeline that are missing certain attributes, and you use there's Kiefner reports and white papers that you can use to close some of your gaps of where you don't have actual what's TVC documentation to confirm your pipe. Then you go into the gap closures, and this is where with the advancement in ILI tools and technology and tools where you can actually go and you integrate with your inspection plans and your assessment plans to go capture that data. There's ILI tools now that can capture your grade of pipe, and then you can go verify that with a Frontix or MMNT tool when actually you do verification digs, and really close the loop on your material verifications. So that's just a high level kind of overview of that process, and obviously there's more details, and you can basically have a whole presentation around that and what you have to do and your procedures and engineering reviews and team boards that you would have with that. So kind of the part one into the part two, with the gas mega rule, which a lot of the, this is, a big one. And I have a lot of the meat of the presentation around this gas gathering rule, because it affected so many miles, roughly 400, I believe around 430,000 miles, additional miles are going to be brought into some type of regulation with this rule. And so some of the key items with the rule itself, it expands the reporting criteria to all gathering lines. So at the minimum, if you determine that you as an operator have a gathering line, you're going to have to do a report. And this year, in March 15th, was the deadline for this initial first report. And then the big thing was that it added 2 additional types. So previously you had a type A and a type B gathering line. And so with this new rule, it brought in the type C and a type R. And the type R, as I mentioned, is for the reporting criteria. And so that type R means reporting only. So you only have to report that mileage. And then one of the type C is the one that really is a critical to operators, because that is the population of lines that are in class 1 locations. So this was typically your really rural, not within city limits and towns. These are the lines that are out in the West Texas, New Mexico areas. And so those are the class 1 lines that are now type C if it meets certain criteria, which I'll get into a little bit. Essentially, if it's 8-inch or greater, and it operates over 20% of SMICE, then that would fall within the type C regulations. And there's new implications that operators have to have that they normally wouldn't have to. So going into some of the operations and maintenance manuals and items that you have to have for those requirements. And then emergency response, public awareness, damage prevention, installing line markers, doing leak surveys. And so those are some of the requirements for the type C lines that historically, operators of these pipelines did not have to include. So now they have to include that within their programs, but then also to the additional cost and the resources needed to complete those tasks. And they also did, there were some after the final rule came out for the gathering, some of the industry groups went back and challenged PHMSA on some of the items. And that's where some of the exceptions you can see on the third to last bullet. For type C lines, there are exceptions based on if you have gas transmission lines and you grant high consequence area analysis HCAs, then you may be familiar. But so when you run an HCA, you're looking at a potential impact radius from your pipeline. So you're looking at your pipe attributes, the product of your line, which these would be natural gas, and then the pressures. And so with that, you're going to have, if you have a rupture, you're going to have an impact radius around your pipeline. And so with the gathering lines, you have to use a factor of 0.73, as typically on the transmission lines, you're allowed to use 0.69 factor for gas. But since most of the gas gathering lines are not gonna be your typical dry gas, so that's why you have to use a 0.73 factor into your calculation. And so when you run your HCA analysis, you can still use the same method 1, method 2 scenarios. And if you do not have an identified site within your potential impact radius, then there are exceptions for the type Cs. And essentially the exceptions, the final requirements, if you meet the exception, would then be that your pipeline would then have to have a emergency response plan and a damage prevention plan, and all of the other requirements you would have to comply with. And that's for the exceptions are only for the 8-inch up to including the 16-inch. Anything over, you cannot get an exception for. So some of those timelines, and I've kind of may have got ahead of myself on some of these, but the rule was published in November of 2021 and went into effect May of last year. And then, as I mentioned, the reporting deadline, the initial reporting deadline was this past March 15th. And then obviously if you're installing a new pipeline, then you have to go through that methodology using RP80 to determine, yes, the line is gathering, and then basically assigning is it a type A, type B, C, or R before it goes into place and into operation. And so we're still in that within it just passed as far as the compliance. So we can expect operators probably expect at maybe sometime this year or later this year or next year, probably start seeing some inspections from the state representatives, depending on what state you're in, Railroad Commission or OCC, depending on where your operations are at for those. Obviously, there's a lot of rules that have come out, and the regulators are pretty overwhelmed. They'll start rolling these out at some point, probably end of the year. A little bit of the process for the gathering determination. So the rule states that you have to use API recommended practice 80 on how to find an onshore gathering line. And then once you determine that you do, as an operator, have a gathering line, you go into your class analysis and you do your class location analysis, which you have to go through structure verification based on buildings intended for human occupancies. And then once you determine what type, your class 1 through 4, and then you go and assign your types. So you can see I have the table as far as what type A, type B, C, and R for how those fall into. And then you have to know your operating parameters and what your percentage of SMICE that you're operating, because that also too comes into play when you're operating less than 20% of SMICE and greater than 20% of SMICE on how you may fall into a category. And so you can see as part of that, you need materials and verifications on some of these lines, and they're really, if you look at I go back to the 2011, again, on the materials verification, we're seeing it time over time on the importance of the records and knowing what your pipeline is from materials, because it all comes into play with all of the new rules. So I hit on some of these, but the implications to the operators. So you have to go through and determine your production versus gathering lines. There's going to be which a lot of operators probably already have conducted and may be still conducting field verifications for those missing records to either confirm or update the determinations that they've made. Everyone should have completed the reporting of March this year. So I'm sure a lot of folks had learning curves of getting op IDs and getting their registration in place, and then assimilating their mileage and information to report. And then starting implementing those additional requirements of cathodic protection, establishing MAOPs for those 12-inch and greater pipelines, being enrolled in damage prevention, public awareness, emergency response, installing line markers. So I know typically most operators would have been in some kind of damage prevention program. Usually every state has an 811 requirement. So that one is what I've seen from operators usually have a program in place, but the ancillary items with the CP systems and making sure that they have line markers, and then actually doing leak surveys with leak detection equipment are all new requirements that are a new burden from a resource standpoint and a cost standpoint to the operators. And then just the learning curve itself with not having to deal with the PHMSA rules prior. So I know a lot of operators are still, learning and getting the information and figuring out, what the plans and items they have to have in place. So kick into the valve installation rule. And so this is another one that came out the end of last year, and actually April this year is when it went into enforcement time frames, and this actually covers the gas transmission pipelines, the type A gas gathering, and the hazardous liquid pipelines of diameters of 6 inches and greater. So, and it applies to any new or replaced pipelines that meet that criteria. So if you fall within that criteria, that is what is required. And so some of the rules and the items within the rules are the looking at your valve spacing, updating your procedures, so your O&M. So there's critical items that operators have to go in, and it should have been done by October of last year to update your O&M and your specific procedures for those rupture mitigation valves, and how you're using either that R&B or some alternate technology, and how you put those in with your programs. And also there's with updating your emergency response, and contacting, so some of the requirements, contacting 911, potential ruptures. You also have to update your procedures, and you have to have your post-rupture investigations. And then performing post-event reviews of any incidents, accidents, or other failures of the RMVs, and you have to apply those lessons learned for that. And then like I said, the stated before, you have to update your emergency plans to reflect the new requirements of those pipelines. And then it also includes some maintenance on the RMVs as well. And so I know, and I want to touch on, so I mentioned it's the new or entirely replaced pipelines. And so the entirely replaced is generally is what the rules say is 2 or more miles of pipe replaced within a continuous 5-mile segment during a 24-month period. So that's where you come into if it's your replacement side of that. And I know that these, if you're an operator, these inspections are coming out. I know some operators work with some operators that have already had some of these inspections conducted. So the states and PHMSA have included those within their question sets. And so wrapping up kind of on the mega rule part is the final rule, called the final rule of the kind of the 3-part series, was the part 3 that came out of August of last year. And those, this is the part 3 was really gas transmission specific, and kind of 4 main areas that the final rule covered, and that was the management of change. So your MOC process, and that requires operators to have an MOC process and have that documentation, and incorporates the section of one, it's the actual code is 192.13, and some of the ASME B31.8 standards requirements. The second one, which was pretty expansive, was around the corrosion control. And so this expanded the requirements for the gas transmission pipelines. And as I stated, this was transmission specific because they exempt some of the gathering and distribution pipelines for now. I would expect that the part of these rules probably in the upcoming or new regulations would include the gathering and distribution pipelines, but as of now, it's transmission specific. And so some of those key items within that corrosion control are the installation of pipe in the ditch and coating surveys. So it requires operators to perform indirect above ground assessments. So that's going to be your ACVG or DCVG, that's your alternating current voltage gradient, or direct current voltage gradient. So you can identify those locations that could have damage before you actually backfill your pipeline. And so that way you can, remediate if you have that. It also includes interference surveys. So It requires operator to perform interference when electrical potential monitoring indicates significant increase in straight current or new potential straight current sources. And so then you also have to, if you do find an issue, then you have 15 months, you have to remediate those items. And then there also includes the external and internal corrosion items. And so for the external items, PHMSA set a 1-year timeline for repairing any deficiencies in your CP system. And it also requires an annual test station readings to make sure that the subpart I, which is your corrosion control standards, are met. And then with the internal corrosion, operators are now required to monitor for harmful gas streams to where you can have corrosion containments. And that has to be done once per calendar year, not to exceed 15 months. So again, that's another item that has to go within your procedures, so your O&M updates. So that those are the main items within the corrosion control itself. And then another key item is the inspections following extreme weather events. And this includes hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding. If you're an operator in Texas and back in 2021, the freeze. So any kind of extreme weather. Now operators have to do an inspection within 72 hours once a operator determines it's reasonably safe to go out and perform those inspections. So once you reasonably determine that an affected area can be safely accessed by personnel, then that's when the clock starts, that 72-hour clock starts. And if you actually have assets in Texas, so you may know that talking about the weather, so the Railroad Commission implemented the critical infrastructure rules as well. So just if you do have assets, and you should know about that, and that kind of ties into these extreme weather events that PHMSA is putting out. And then the Railroad Commission, based on the freeze, with some of the issues we have with power grids and the wells and facilities that are feeding into the power plants that are affecting the grid, also has additional requirements within there as well. And then the kind of final main item for the final rule was the expansion of the repair criteria for HCAs and non-HCAs. And so for the non-HCAs, that includes immediate 2-year and monitor criteria. And so it's similar to if you have a transmission line and you're have a IMP program subject to subpart O, then it's similar to there, and you have to implement pressure reductions per the specified criteria within those items for that. And then it also includes some of the items that you have to address based, immediate for your HCAs for that segment. And then just recently, this was just published and was a limited enforcement discretion. So this ties back into the the final part rule that was just put out and from last year. And so PHMSA came out and published that they're going to have a limited enforcement for the provisions in this latest final rule for lines that existed before August 24th for an additional 9 months. So this is going to apply to your operations and maintenance updates that we just covered that operators will have to conduct. And they applied the same logic to the new or replaced gas transmission lines. Now the new lines, they do have some exceptions around the corrosion control. So those items that I talked about on the construction, where with the CP surveys prior to backfilling. So those items still have to be conducted on the newly replaced or new lines for that. And so essentially, PHMSA is not going to enforce the O&M manuals and the requirements before February 24th, 2024. So we, as operators, it gives some timelines to actually get those items in place. So that wraps up the overview of the mega rule and all the 3 parts. And I want to touch on, and I'll try to get through this kind of quickly so we can have some questions. Is I want to recap the section 113, 114 items from the Pipeline Safety Act of 2020. So this was after. So you had the initial part 1 of the mega rule in October of 2019. So then 2020 was the Pipes Act. And one of the key items within the Pipes Act is the section 113 and 114, the leak detection and repair. So the part 113 is really that the PHMSA mandated that they come up with a program to determine pipe leak detection and repairs no later than December of 2021. And so that's going to apply to the transmission, gathering, and gas distribution for that. So that's really just the secretary saying, hey, we've got to have this done. And then section 114 is really what the operators have to comply with. And this should already be within your programs. That due date was the December of 2021, and the states and PHMSA are inspecting. They've already started inspecting last year. And so what the requirements are is that the operators have to update their O&M and procedures on how they're going to eliminate hazardous leaks, minimize releases, and that applies to what you're doing from a inspection, daily maintenance, your operation, into your design procedures of new lines, of how you're going to install your, what type of equipment, relief valves and things like that you're going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases and methane emissions that you could potentially vent to atmosphere. And so this is part of the code that has to be changed. And this is like I said, eliminate the leaks and minimizing the releases of natural gas from the pipelines in these facilities. And then a key thing to kind of take away from this too is it really talked about the gas side of it, and the methane, but this also applies to liquid pipeline operators as well. And so some of you may, if you have liquid lines, you may have been inspected. But just because you operate a liquid pipeline, don't think that this rule doesn't apply to you. It does. And what PHMSA and the states are looking for is obviously based on the type of liquid that you're running. If you have a spill, it could then have vapors that then go into that emissions category, for one, and then also two, what type of equipment are you using to operate? Are you using gas to operate your valves, your actuators? Are you using it to run your pumps or compressors within your facilities? So they're actually going out to those ancillary equipments that are tied into your pipeline. And there's certain requirements that those are requirements apply to those items as well. So that's a key item. A lot of, when you first look at the rule and say, well, I'm running a liquid line, really doesn't apply to me, but you still have to address that and make sure that your procedures and everything are updated for that. And then kind of last thing on this is another key one, because it really ties into all of the MAOP and the TVC materials verification that I talked about. Is that the operators have to have a plan to address either replace or remediate their pipelines that are known to leak based on the materials. So that's unprotected steel, cast iron, and some of your old historic plastics, pipelines that you don't know. And so again, that really brings into, well, I got to know what I have in the ground to be able to do that. So that's why I want to kind of address that item there, because when you look at from a materials verifications, we're seeing it in every rule simply is being addressed that they're putting out. Is some type of verification of materials. So it's really those records are critical to have. So that's the end of the presentation there. So we'll open it up to questions. Tony, I don't know if you have to let people in or.
No, people can just go ahead and unmute. If they have any questions. Got a quiet bunch here today.
Yeah, and if you don't, if you have a question and don't want to ask it, or maybe once we get off, if you don't think of a question right now, but you do after we get off, I will give this presentation to Tony to send out to everybody that's registered. And then Tony has my information that she can pass along as well. So you can reach out to me. You can call me or send me an email with your question, and I will respond back.
Okay, I've got one question, Roger DeMuth. It's do the produced water systems that recycle produced water, are they subject to these mega rules?
No. So the water, those are not applicable to the new rules.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anyone else? Okay, well, we've got our question out of the way. If anyone else has any more questions, like he said, I can put you in contact with him. We're going to send out the presentation. I also have a copy, a recording copy of this presentation that I will send with the link. Other than that, thank you guys for coming out today. Thank you, Colby, again for putting this on and educating us. Other than that, I think we're good to go. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.